It's one thing to build a bunch of cool stuff for your tabletop game. It's a different thing entirely to effectively use it. I mean, how do you actually implement this stuff in your game? Where do you put it? How do you plan for it? How do you put it on the table without disrupting the game? How do you do this? Hey guys, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. This is a question that comes up fairly often, both from new players and veterans alike who are for the first time trying to implement some 3D elements into their tabletop role-playing games. It's a very huge, vast topic. It's highly subjective, and there's absolutely no way to fully explain or cover this in one video, but I'm gonna do my best to share with you some of the things that I do and my mindsets when it goes into using this sort of stuff in my actual games to the best of my ability. I first have to point out that the usage of terrain is actually pretty different when you compare tabletop wargaming to tabletop RPGs. In wargaming, before the game, you set up the table, and actually every player can be involved in that setup process. And once it's done, you just start playing and you're not worrying about moving things around. But in an RPG, it's different because it all falls on the DM's shoulders, and it's supposed to be a kind of a surprise for the players, and it's constantly changing. It is a lot more difficult to implement terrain in RPGs. It's a lot harder to do really elaborate setups. With wargaming, you can put a lot of effort into making buildings and tiles and all these things look really, really good because you're gonna use them a lot. You just set them on the table and you're good to go. But in RPGs, it's a whole other ballgame. So for the purpose of this video, I'm specifically talking about the usage in RPGs. One really important thing to know is that you don't need to make and represent everything. While these pieces we make look really cool and they're exciting and they're meant to add to the overall experience of the game, at the end of the day, they're just visual aids to help represent where things are physically in the game. It's really a mechanical thing, and you don't need every little detail. You just need the important ones that show space and, some things that maybe enhance the aesthetic or give something to the experience. But you don't need to make and represent everything. That is the biggest trap that most new people fall into. Not only do you not need to represent everything that is in a room during an encounter, but you don't need to represent every encounter physically on the table. In a night of gameplay in D&D, you might have 3 encounters and a couple role-playing things, a visit to town. You don't need to build and represent all of that stuff. I constantly see people building taverns as their first project, which to me personally, I think is crazy. I mean, build whatever you want, enjoy it, but how much action is taking place in that tavern? You don't need a physical representation of it just to dialogue someone giving a quest. And you don't even need to represent every combat encounter with terrain. You can absolutely have one setup at the end of the night that has a ton of elaborate stuff and is really cool that you put a lot of work into, and then the other 2 encounters that night, it's just a battle mat, dry erase with some minis and maybe a little bit of scatter. You don't need an elaborate setup every single encounter. And in fact, I'd actually argue that it is good for your game and your player's gaming experience overall to not represent every encounter with terrain, because the more you use it, the less it kind of wows your players. It can start to become kind of boring. You keep setting that bar up and up and up, and then all of a sudden, a big, crazy, elaborate set isn't that interesting. If you change it up all the time and have a battle mat sometimes, maybe just theater of the mind an encounter, because that's fine too. When you put this stuff on the table, it's gonna still have that wow factor, and it's gonna relieve a lot of pressure to you as the DM, knowing going into planning a game that you're not going to be limited to or stressed out by having to create everything. If you want to run a module and you come to a part that, oh, how am I going to build this, or I don't have time to build it, then don't. Just run it, RP it, theater of the mind it, dry erase, battle mat it, whatever. Just use the terrain sparingly, as much as you want, and don't feel you have to do it all the time. When it comes to actually using and implementing the terrain, a big question that comes up is, doesn't it interfere with the game or slow the game down? And in all honesty, yeah, it does, and it can, and that's okay. The more you use it, the faster you're gonna get at setting these things up. When it comes to major set changes, from one big elaborate setup to another, if you're gonna have them back to back, I find that the best way to deal with this is just to put a pause on the game. Let everybody take a 5-minute break, go stretch their legs, use the bathroom, refill their drinks and snacks and whatever, while you set everything up. They're gonna come back, they won't have seen you setting it all up, which could kind of, maybe make it less exciting. They're gonna come back, they're gonna be refreshed, they're gonna see this new setup on the table, and they're gonna sit down excited to jump into the next bit of gameplay. So not only does this give you some breathing room as the DM to set up without a bunch of eyes watching you, it actually is really healthy for the game itself, because when you don't have those types of breaks, just in general, people can get fidgety and start, kind of getting a little bit stir crazy. It's kind of disruptive. You give the game that pause, that break, so that these little disruptions don't happen elsewhere, and you give yourself a time to set up things in peace and quiet. That being said, I don't think you should be needing to do a lot of those big setup breaks during every game, maybe one, maybe two. I play on a small gaming surface for a reason. Well, a couple reasons, but one of them is so that it contains the scope of the setup to a small little space. A lot of people probably think I have a insane tile collection, but I actually don't. My basic tiles, I only have like a dozen 3x3 tiles, a couple 6x6s and 12x12s. I don't have a lot of them, and the reason is that I don't set up big sprawling dungeons in one go. I treat my games kind of like a side-scrolling video game. Well, not really side-scrolling, but like top-down. There's some tiles on the table where the players currently are. It might show the exits or the halls or the doors or whatever going out of that room. As they move through the doorway or down the hall, I will then place the next tile if there's room, or I'll remove that tile and replace it with the next one. So it's kind of always constantly refreshing, and you're not building up this big scene. You just get a snapshot of any given moment in the game as to where things are. This way you use less terrain, it takes up less space, and it's a lot easier to set up. And this type of setup and terrain placement you don't do during breaks. You actually do it while you're playing. And this takes a little bit of practice. Essentially, what you want to be doing as the DM is using the moments when the set is changing from room to room to do your narration and explain the whatever exposition you're doing, explaining what the room looks like, smells like, all that good stuff while you're placing tiles, or answering questions. If people are doing things, you are role-playing out the consequences of those things while you're setting it up, and that way people are focused on you, the DM, and the story, and not what your hands are doing setting up the tiles necessarily. And the more you practice this, the better you're gonna get at it. This is also a time when you can take advantage of the kind of phenomenon that takes place in a gaming session where, and you know this if you played a lot, your players all of a sudden start talking back and forth and over-analyzing something. They're gonna go into the next room and they're talking in excruciating detail about who should go first and should I use the torch or should I use this? And they get in this loop of kind of metagaming, And that's okay, use that to your advantage, because while they're doing that, you are setting stuff up, and by the time they've figured out what the hell they're gonna do, the next room is ready for the minis to be placed on. In order to do this really effectively and smoothly, it does require some pre-planning. So if you have a dungeon that you know the party is gonna be going through that night, the best thing you can do is to take some time the night or the day before and kind of set up all those rooms and figure out what tiles you need and what scatter terrain, what minis. Lay them out and then take them aside and put them somewhere in groups. So you have kind of like room A, B, C, D, kind of all ready to go. And where you put this is gonna depend on your gaming space. Typically what I do is I just use some fold up TV trays that I put behind me. I have all the rooms and minis and items separate and ready to go. I'll put a little DM screen in front of it so that people don't see it. When I'm running the game, I just turn around, grab the stuff for that room, and I'm good to go. And this helps if you have a dungeon where there's a couple different options of which way they're gonna go. You have kind of all the next rooms ready and waiting. How do you do this if you have a massive sprawling dungeon with a lot of different options for travel direction and it's not a very linear space? How do you prepare that? How do you prepare terrain for a more sandbox, open-ended game or dungeon versus a more railroaded one? This is where it's important to circle back to what I said about not having to represent everything and utilizing things like battle mats or just theater of the mind. On a massive dungeon, a great thing to do is to not worry about placing all the little rooms. Just role play those, just do a battle mat to show all the little corridors and little rooms, and then maybe just have the massive, big, important rooms set up and ready to go. The boss battles or the ones that are cool puzzle rooms or whatever. Keep in mind that if you're planning a session and you're looking at the rooms or the layouts and you're thinking, man, this is way too complicated to do with terrain, then it probably is. So just don't. You don't have to not run it or not do that room or module or whatever. Just don't use the terrain. Use some of those other tools that are at your disposal. And at the end of the day, you can always fall back on theater of the mind. It is nice when you're doing your own homebrew settings and dungeons and stuff, because then what you can do is actually plan out a map that works well around your tiles. A lot of pre-published maps don't work very well with tile systems, or they might work well with one but not the other. And if you're planning your own dungeons and drawing your own maps, then you can actually use your terrain and tiles to kind of decide that layout, and then it works really well for your system. But of course, if you're using somebody else's map, just use something different or change the map, do whatever, it doesn't matter. Don't let this stuff bog you down and get in the way of enjoying and running a successful game. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all the important stuff you need to know when approaching this subject. Like I said, it's a massive subject and everybody's gonna think about it differently. And possibly this video just raised more questions than it did answers. So if you have more questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. And if you have your own tips and tricks and things that maybe I didn't mention, also feel free to put those below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button, let me know. I really hope this is helpful because I know this is an intimidating aspect of getting into this part of the hobby for a lot of people. It's one thing to sit down in your own time and build something, but to actually use it in front of a group of players, I know it can be very stressful, but it doesn't have to be. As usual, if you enjoyed this video and the videos that I do, there's two great ways that you can help me keep making them. One is by doing your regular shopping for tools and supplies on my Amazon affiliate page at blackmagiccraft.ca. That way you get the stuff that I actually use and recommend. Doesn't cost you any extra, and I get a small commission that helps fund videos like this one. The other really awesome way you can help out is by supporting Black Magic Craft on Patreon. And through Patreon, you can join the Black Magic Craft Fellowship, which is a private Facebook group where there's a ton of cool people who will help you with all sorts of things really quickly. I jump in there as much as I can, and that's really becoming the only way to get me to answer specific questions because I am overloaded with them. So I try to answer the ones there with the highest priority. So consider checking it out and supporting Blackmagic Craft. That's it for this week, guys. Cheers. See you again next week.